When Maria Johnson, a young black attorney, stepped into Judge Thomas Weller's courtroom, she faced blatant condescension and public humiliation that questioned her very competence. Weller, a man used to unquestioned authority, mocked her before the room, underestimating her skill and intelligence. But Maria transformed her anger into precision, presenting irrefutable evidence and arguments that left the judge speechless. Just wait until you see how she turned the tables, claimed justice for her client, and left the courtroom, and everyone in it, completely awed. It was a brisk Monday morning in downtown Chicago, the kind of morning where the air feels sharp against the skin and the city hums with urgency. The courthouse loomed like a fortress, its stone facade reflecting the gray light of early autumn. Inside, the courtroom of Judge Thomas Weller buzzed with quiet anticipation, the spectators shuffling papers and exchanging whispers. Maria Johnson stepped through the tall wooden doors, her polished black shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. Every step carried years of preparation, late nights in law school, internships that had demanded every ounce of her energy, and a determination forged in countless small battles against doubt and expectation. Today, she was not just an attorney. She was a protector of her client's rights in a civil case that could set a precedent. As Maria approached the bench, she could feel the weight of the room pressing in. The air seemed denser here, charged with authority, expectation, and an invisible hierarchy she had learned to navigate. Judge Thomas Weller, a man with decades of experience and an imposing presence, was already seated, his robe crisp and his expression unreadable, or so she thought at first glance. Then, as she opened her briefcase and adjusted her notes, he looked up at her with a slight narrowing of the eyes, the kind that seemed to measure her worth before she even spoke. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, just enough to be noticed, just enough to sting. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice calm but laced with condescension, "are you sure you know what you're doing? This isn't a school debate." The words fell like a sudden gust of cold wind, sharp and unexpected. Maria's hands froze over her notes. Not professionally, not in the legal sense. Those skills she had honed through years of study were undeniable. But personally, the comment felt like a direct challenge to her very presence, to her legitimacy. The courtroom murmured in quiet surprise. A few spectators raised their eyebrows, exchanging glances that mirrored disbelief. How could a man sworn to uphold justice treat a professional with such open dismissal? Anger ignited within her like a live wire. It wasn't the fleeting irritation of a small slight. It was a deep, fiery indignation built up over years of similar moments. She remembered other instances, subtle and overt, where her intelligence or competence had been underestimated simply because of who she was. She had been asked to prove herself too many times, each time carrying the weight of expectation and the sting of prejudice. Now, in front of an entire courtroom, that same old dismissal came wrapped in the guise of authority. Her jaw tightened, and she felt her pulse quicken. This was not just an insult, it was an affront to every late night she had spent preparing for a career where she could make a difference. Every accolade, every certificate, every internship that had demanded her relentless focus and determination was being dismissed in a single offhand remark. She felt the heat rise in her chest, a mix of fury and disbelief. How dare he assume incompetence based on a glance, a stereotype, a bias she had worked so hard to overcome? Yet, beneath the raw anger, there was clarity. Mariah recognized that this moment, painful as it was, also defined her opportunity. This was the challenge she had trained for, the situation that would test not only her knowledge of the law, but the strength of her presence, her voice, and her resolve. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself, feeling the anger sharpen into focus rather than scatter into panic. The courtroom waited, watching, anticipating her next move. Mariah knew that how she responded would set the tone, not just for her client, but for every observer who might underestimate her again. Her anger was immediate, undeniable, and uncontainable, but it was also fuel. It was a fire that would drive her arguments, sharpen her points, and demand respect, not through confrontation, but through undeniable competence. Judge Weller might have intended to belittle her, but Mariah understood something he had not yet realized. Experience and skill could never be judged by appearance or preconception. Today, she would make him and everyone in that courtroom see that she belonged. This was the moment when anger transformed into resolve, a defining instant where frustration became a catalyst for precision, for authority, for the start of a fight that was far from over. For a fleeting moment, Mariah Johnson thought about walking out of the courtroom altogether. The idea hovered briefly, like a tempting escape from the suffocating weight of humiliation. The words of Judge Weller, the smirk that had accompanied them, replayed in her mind, sharper each time. It wasn't simply about professional disrespect. It was the subtle, insidious message behind it, that her intellect, her years of hard work, her legitimacy as an attorney could somehow be questioned before a room full of strangers. The sting pressed against her like a physical weight, heavy and unrelenting, gnawing at the confidence she had spent a lifetime cultivating. She had learned to endure moments like this over the years, each small dismissal, each skeptical glance, each assumption that she would not be able to rise to the occasion. But the humiliation was never less painful, even when anticipated. Mariah's mind briefly flicked to her client, seated patiently at the defense table, eyes following her every move. Their case, their future, depended on her ability to remain composed, to command the room, to prove the merit of their argument. And yet, the emotional ache in her chest made her hands tremble slightly over her briefcase. Being publicly underestimated, dismissed, and ridiculed in such a blatant way cut deeper than any technical challenge ever could. When the courtroom recessed for lunch, Mariah moved through the hallways of the courthouse with careful, measured steps. She entered the law library, a sanctuary she had often sought in moments of doubt and reflection. She sat at a polished oak table, surrounded by towering shelves of legal tomes and case files. Flipping through the familiar pages of precedent and statute, she tried to lose herself in the structured certainty of the law. But today, The words offered no solace. Each citation, each argument, seemed hollow in the shadow of the humiliation she had just endured. Memories of other courtroom dismissals came unbidden, each one a reminder of the subtle and overt ways society questioned her competence. The times when she had spoken confidently, only to be interrupted by older colleagues who assumed they knew better. The instances when her opinion was politely acknowledged, then dismissed, leaving her to silently gather herself and continue. Each memory was a sharp, painful echo, suffocating, yet strangely motivating. She realized that the sting she felt was not isolated to this courtroom. It was the accumulation of years of assumptions, of prejudice, of being measured against expectations she had never agreed to. And yet, beneath the suffocating weight, there was a strange clarity. This wasn't just about winning a single case. It was about asserting a truth that went beyond law books and courtrooms. It was about proving that skill, knowledge, and diligence could never be overshadowed by appearance or bias. She thought of her mentor, Judge Evelyn Carter, whose calm voice had often offered guidance in moments of uncertainty. "They can try to make you small, Mariah," she had said, "but your mind and your voice, that's untouchable. Never let anyone take that from you." Mariah closed her eyes for a moment, drawing strength from those words. Pain, she understood now, was not weakness. It was a reminder of the barriers she had already overcome, a measure of the resilience that had brought her to this point. She allowed herself a slow, steadying breath, letting the ache in her chest transform into quiet determination. The library was silent, except for the faint rustle of pages and the distant hum of the city beyond the courthouse walls. But in that silence, Mariah felt the first flicker of resolve. This was her fight, not against Judge Weller alone, but against every assumption, every preconception that had tried to define her limits. The pain, as sharp as it was, became a catalyst. She would channel it into clarity, into strategy, into the precise articulation of her argument. Today, she would not merely defend a client. She would reclaim the respect that had been challenged, asserting, without a trace of doubt, that her place in that courtroom was earned, deserved, and unshakable. Pain had come, uninvited and relentless, but Mariah Johnson understood that it could also be transformed. It was the proving ground for focus, for authority, for the quiet strength that could turn humiliation into power. Returning to the courtroom after the lunch recess, Mariah Johnson carried with her a quiet determination, one forged in the crucible of past challenges and sharpened by the sting of earlier humiliation. The anger that had simmered in her chest during the morning now transformed into a focused clarity, a mental precision that allowed her to approach her arguments with renewed strategy. She adjusted her notes, straightened her posture, and let her gaze sweep the room with calm authority. Today was not about proving herself to the judge. It was about advocating for her client, and in doing so, asserting the undeniable truth of her own competence. From the moment she rose to speak, Mariah anticipated the subtle tactics of interruption, the half-smiles of dismissal, the faint undercurrent of skepticism that often accompanied her appearances in court. She began carefully, deliberately, laying out her points with an elegance that reflected both mastery and experience. Each citation of legal precedent, each well-structured argument, was not only a step forward for the case, but also a hammer striking at the foundations of Judge Weller's assumptions. The courtroom, previously tense with unease, now seemed to lean forward, drawn by the gravity and precision of her voice. With each measured point, Mariah's confidence grew. Her voice, initially steady, became commanding. The calm certainty she projected carried the weight of knowledge and preparation, the kind that could not be ignored or dismissed. Spectators began to sit straighter, eyes following her every motion, sensing the shift in momentum. Even the seasoned attorneys in the room exchanged glances, acknowledging the authority with which she spoke. Judge Weller, once so poised in his smirk, now displayed a subtle tension around his eyes. The corners of his mouth tightened imperceptibly. A faint shadow of doubt crossed his expression. For the first time that morning, the veneer of superiority he had projected showed a crack. Mariah did not allow herself the luxury of satisfaction. She maintained her focus, letting the evidence and argumentation speak louder than any personal emotion. Yet inwardly, she recognized the shift. This was the first sign that the bias he had carried into the courtroom could be confronted, that her skill and preparation were starting to reshape the perception of those around her. As she continued, the tension in the room shifted subtly. Where before there had been apprehension, skepticism, and a muted expectation of failure, now there was curiosity and a budding respect. Mariah could feel it, the collective recognition that this was not the same moment as before. Hope sparked in her chest, steady and bright, but it extended beyond herself. It extended to the spectators, her client, and even to every young attorney who might one day face a similar challenge. There was an unspoken acknowledgment in the air that merit, preparation, and courage could indeed command attention and respect, regardless of prior assumptions. Her arguments were precise, but also imbued with quiet passion. She emphasized not only the legal technicalities, but the ethical responsibility at the heart of the case. Her client's rights were not abstract principles. They were tangible, vital, and deserving of defense. In presenting these facts, she reclaimed the narrative, transforming what had been a moment of personal humiliation into an assertion of authority. The courtroom, once dominated by the judge's condescension, now felt aligned with the truth she was articulating. By the time she concluded this segment of her presentation, Mariah's voice resonated with the full weight of competence and certainty. The courtroom had shifted. Momentum was no longer in Judge Weller's favor. Hope was no longer a fragile spark. It was a quiet, pervasive force that underscored the reversal of roles. Mariah had not only reclaimed control of her own dignity, but she had also begun to change the energy in the room, demonstrating that authority, skill, and persistence could overcome even the most entrenched bias. Hope, once uncertain and fragile, now thrummed with potential. The stage was set for the next phase, where knowledge and integrity would continue to guide the course of justice. Finally, the moment arrived. Mariah Johnson, poised and resolute, presented the key evidence that would turn the tide of the case. She placed a set of meticulously organized documents on the bench, each page a precise record of facts, timelines, and precedents that left no room for doubt. These were not merely legal forms, they were the story of her client's experience, carefully documented, reinforced by laws and regulations that had been painstakingly cited. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and as Maria spoke, the clarity and authority in her voice left the room captivated. She concluded with a plea that blended both the rigor of the law and the moral imperative behind the case. Her words were deliberate, each syllable chosen to illuminate not just the legal standing of her argument, but also the principle at stake. Justice, she declared, is not selective. It cannot bend to prejudice or assumption. My client deserves the protection the law promises, and the recognition of their rights is not negotiable. The courtroom fell silent, every ear straining to absorb the conviction behind her words. Even the spectators who had initially doubted her abilities now felt the undeniable presence of competence and courage. Judge Thomas Weller, the same man who had earlier smirked and questioned her knowledge, leaned back in his chair. His eyes widened, and a rare moment of vulnerability crossed his expression. For a man who had rarely admitted error, rarely shown uncertainty, the realization of the argument's strength was startling. The weight of truth and preparation pressed against the walls of his preconceptions, and he could not ignore it. I apologize, Miss Johnson, he stammered, voice cautious yet sincere, the first acknowledgment of respect Maria had received from him that day. Your arguments are impeccable. The words were measured, but their impact was immense. They were not simply a personal vindication. They were a recognition of skill, preparation, and integrity in the face of bias. The courtroom, which had been tense with anticipation for hours, released a collective exhale. Subdued applause rippled through the room, a mixture of relief, admiration, and acknowledgment of what had just transpired. Maria maintained her composure, her posture steady, but she allowed herself a small, victorious smile. It was a smile that carried the weight of years of perseverance, of challenges overcome, of countless moments where her presence had been questioned and her abilities underestimated. The triumph in that moment extended beyond the immediate legal victory. It was a statement to every young black attorney who had felt unseen, every professional who had faced condescension, and every individual striving to assert their worth in spaces that too often underestimated them. Walking out of the courtroom, Maria felt a quiet energy thrumming in her chest. It was the kind of inspiration that could not be quantified, only felt, a deep understanding that truth, skill, and courage could command respect even when assumptions and prejudice tried to overshadow them. She passed through the courthouse doors and into the city streets, her steps lighter, more purposeful. Each stride resonated with the knowledge that victory was not solely about a single case, but about breaking down barriers, setting a standard, and creating space for others to be recognized on merit alone. The sun, now higher in the sky, reflected off the glass buildings, scattering light across the sidewalk. Mariah's thoughts lingered on the courtroom, the evidence, and the unwavering resolve that had carried her through. Inspiration pulsed with each heartbeat, a reminder that even in spaces dominated by doubt and bias, preparation, integrity, and courage could change perceptions and rewrite expectations. Her triumph had been hard-won, meticulous, and undeniable. Yet it was also a beacon, a signal that justice, when pursued with unwavering focus and skill, was possible. Mariah Johnson walked on, not only victorious in the case she had defended, but as a living testament to resilience, professionalism, and the transformative power of determination. In her steps, the world could see that no judgment, however unfair, could diminish the impact of truth realized and courage exercised.